Ladies and gentlemen, today's episode of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is about to begin. But before we start, I posed the following nature question. If you went into the forest and took every bear, moose, deer, raccoon, fisher, bobcat, squirrel, or mammal of any kind, and all the birds in the forest, and put them into one big pile, and if you took every spotted salamander, blue spotted salamander, wood frog, and maybe all the turtles and other critters that breed in or use those puddles in that same forest and put them in a pile, which pile would be bigger? Somewhere in today's show, you'll find out. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is going underground today and underwater. Christine Hoffman is a PhD candidate at the University of Maine. She studies frogs, turtles, salamanders, and she did a slideshow presentation at Maine Audubon's Fields Pond Center in Holden this winter, talking about turtles and frogs. You're about to learn a whole lot more about Maine turtles than you ever imagined. Yeah, turtles. It's easy to get excited about all the big charismatic game animals like deer, moose, and bear, but Maine is so rich in wildlife that we often overlook what's right under our noses. Now, as I said, this was a slideshow and a lecture, so I'll have to do some simultaneous translation and interpretation of what we're seeing. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS. As the lecture begins, let's get started with a very basic question.
So when we think of frogs and we think of turtles, we'll have to split them first into what the classes, what they are. We've got one that's an amphibian and one that's a reptile. Amphibians and reptiles are almost always lumped together. The study of amphibians and reptiles is herpetology, same base word as herpes. Greek means crawling things. So, yeah, they're crawly things. But amphibians and reptiles aren't really that closely related. In fact, we're more closely related to reptiles than reptiles are to amphibians. If you had a lizard next to you, it's more closely related to you than it is to a salamander, even though it looks just like a salamander with scales.
Wait, what? We're more closely related to reptiles than lizards are to salamanders? Without going into too much detail, lizards, and the birds that evolved from them, and also us, don't need water as part of our life cycle. Our eggs, whether laid on the ground or carried by the female, are surrounded by protective shells and membranes, like amniotic sacs. Amphibians have to lay eggs in water. So do fish. So lizards and mammals evolved away from needing to lay eggs in water like fish and amphibians do, and so we and lizards could go colonize drier areas of the planet. You won't find an amphibian in the desert very often. This all happened something like 312 million years ago.
The big differences between frogs and turtles has to do with how they can retain water and then how they choose to reproduce and their lifestyles. Frogs usually have to stay near water. Amphibians have very permeable skin, whereas reptiles have these nice scales around them. And you can think of the scales like saran wrap. It's there to hold the water in. If you didn't have skin yourself that held water in, when you went out and you're walking around in the fields or you're at your desk at work, you'd be losing water pretty rapidly and you would desiccate. Because of this, the frogs have to stay near water to be able to reproduce, to be able to survive. But the reptiles, they can get away from the water.
So, big difference. Amphibians have permeable skin. Water can go through the skin and it can dry out through the skin. That's bad, so they need to be wet or wettish. Amphibians can take in oxygen through their skin. Lizards and the turtles we're talking mostly about today are covered in hard scales to keep the water in. They can only breathe through nostrils, the way we do.
Another big difference between the frogs and the turtles is that the way that they deal with predators. The strategy to being a frog is, okay, something is going to eat me. I am a hopping hamburger. So in order to reproduce and have enough offspring to survive for the following generations, I need to pump out babies as quickly as I can and as many as I can. If you're a turtle, you're the opposite end of the spectrum. Well, I'm going to live for 100 years. So if a raccoon eats all of my babies this year, I'll just make more later. So the reproduction is going to vary drastically because of these different life strategies. For the turtles, They lay eggs, the eggs have shells on them. That means they don't have to be laid in water. The turtles and other amphibians don't have eggshells. If we take those eggs out of the water and leave them on land for a matter of like 3 hours, they're going to dry up and they're going to die. So the amphibians must stay near the wetlands. The turtles can get far out from the wetlands. They can find the nicest, warmest, sunniest, sandiest spot where their eggs are going to be nice and dry. They're going to develop quickly. They don't produce their own body heat, so they need energy from the surrounding area. They need that warmth to help the embryos develop. This Blanding's turtle here is going to lay maybe a dozen eggs, whereas this wood frog is going to lay close to 2,000.
So that's a big difference. When you see one of those vernal pools in the woods and it's filled with turtles sitting on a log and lots of tadpoles in the water, here's what's going on. Turtles live a long time and lay just a few eggs on land. Frogs live a short time and lay thousands of eggs and hope a few survive. If you ever hear about the importance of vernal pools, this is the reason. By definition, vernal pools don't have fish in them. Fish would eat the eggs. Vernal pools generally don't have inlets or outlets. It's mostly just a lot of snowmelt and a depression with a lens of clay under it, so it retains water longer. And they mostly dry up later in summer. Now that's not to say that the eggs don't get eaten. Big critters, like even bears, will get into these pools and gulp down egg clusters. But mostly the strategy works. But take away the vernal pools and a whole part of the wildlife food chain just goes to smithereens. Now, this is the good part. It's happening this time of year, right now. All the frogs and other amphibians are in a mating frenzy. They're all pushing and shoving each other, trying to get to a female. Amphibians dump the eggs in the water around them, and the males fertilize them externally. So how do you win this competition? You grab onto the lady and hang on tight.
So here we've got two wood frogs. We've got the male on top, and he's hugging the female. She will not lay her eggs unless she's getting a bear hug from a male. He has stopper pads on his thumbs, like rubber, to make more friction, so that if another male comes and starts pushing him, he won't be able to knock him off. He wants to make sure that he holds on to that female, because every other frog in that pond wants to get at her too. All the other males want to get at her too. So he holds on, and when she's ready, she starts to lay her eggs, and he just dumps his sperm in the water on top of them. Some of the sperm will swim down into the eggs, fertilize those eggs. Those eggs hatch, and they turn into a tadpole.
We often think of amphibians as meaning that they are both land and water animals. That's not quite right. It means they start out as water animals, then become land animals, even though they may spend most of their time in water. So a tadpole starts out looking more like a fish. It's got this long tail for swimming and just little tiny legs. As the tadpole matures, the tail gets smaller, the legs get bigger, and eventually becomes an animal that can jump on land a distance 30 times greater than its own length. Some tree frogs can jump 50 times their own length. That's like humans jumping the length of a football field without even a running start.
And then turtles are pretty much the opposite. Turtles have internal fertilization. And that works out really well for this turtle. That female frog has to find the spot that she wants to lay her eggs, and the male's on top of her the whole time. She's got this big, blocky, not exactly aerodynamic thing that she's pulling around in the water with her, that's holding on to dear life. Sometimes the male frogs will drown the female frogs because they're so eager they don't let them go up for air. So it's costly to have your male attached to you in order for it to lay the sperm in the water to get to your eggs. The turtles, they just wander around until they find each other. They do a little turtle copulation. He goes off and does his thing. She goes and she finds a place to lay eggs next. Because her eggs have shells and she can leave the wetlands, she can go up to 2 miles away. And Blanding's turtles will. Blanding's turtles will go 2 miles away from the wetland if that's the spot that they've always laid their eggs and they know it's nice and sunny. And if there's a road in the way, they'll just cross it. If there's a field in the way, they'll cross that too. If there's a housing development, well, it hasn't been there the past 20 years, so I know my nesting site's on the other side, they'll cross that too. That creates problems for the turtles. But when they get there, they've got these nice conditions to lay their eggs in. They don't have the fish swimming around looking for their eggs, so they've got less predators.
Or at least that's the way it used to be. If a subdivision goes in, turtles will still try to get to their traditional egg-laying spot, but lots of things like to eat eggs, and some of them are drawn to subdivisions. Raccoons like to raid the garbage. Foxes take advantage of the food supply around humans, like raccoons and squirrels. Both predators will dig up a nest and devour the eggs. Baby turtles are vulnerable too. Out of 12 eggs laid, maybe one will survive. What you're hearing is a presentation about frogs and turtles from Christine Hoffman, a graduate student at the University of Maine who is on the verge of becoming Dr. Hoffman. This slideshow happened at Fields Pond Audubon Center in Holden many weeks ago. But the frogs and turtles are coming out now, so that's why it's today's feature on Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, here on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Today's show is coming to you from Holden, the home of Fields Pond Audubon Center. In late winter, Christine Hoffman, a wildlife biologist and doctoral candidate at the University of Maine, put on the most fascinating presentation about frogs and turtles that I've ever seen. I sat in the front row with my microphone and saved it for when the frogs and turtles were getting really frisky, which is right now. So before the break, we were talking about all the things that will eat a baby turtle and why less than 10% of them ever survive, even if the eggs avoid getting eaten before they hatch.
And you will have frogs eating these guys. You will have hens eating them. Raccoons will eat them. Chipmunks will eat baby turtles, which kind of ruins chipmunks for me. So the turtles have another advantage that might not be as obvious here. The larval phase really messes up. It really makes it harder to go from being a frog egg into a little tiny baby juvenile frog. They're called froglets. That's the technical term for that. That is a froglet. So when you're an adult wood frog, you wander around the forest and you eat bugs and slugs and worms and meat. When you're a tadpole, you're eating algae. You're a vegetarian. When you start to metamorph, your digestive system needs to change from being a vegetarian into being a carnivore. If you think about the gut of a horse or the gut of a cow, cows are famous for having so many chambers of their stomachs. It's because you need a lot of area to be able to break down the roughage that's in plant material. You don't need that kind of gut to be able to break down insects. Insects are nicely packaged protein that's easy to digest and easy to absorb, lots of calories, good to eat bugs. So to go from being a tadpole to metamorphing to being a froglet, your entire digestive system shuts down. There's about a week where they don't eat because they don't have a digestive system anymore. During that time, they're cannibalizing their tail. They release enzymes that goes into their tail, starts to digest it, breaks it down, and they take that energy and use it to survive. So when we look at tadpoles, they're chubby. Tadpoles are cute, they're really fat. And then when they metamorph into froglets, they lose all this weight and they become these skinny, tiny little things. The immune system has to break down for this to happen because your white blood cells, they've always been looking for tadpole cells. And now you're starting to have frog cells. And what are these frog cells doing here? They're not supposed to be here. You're not a frog, you're a tadpole. So the immune system has to shut off so it doesn't attack the developing frog.
See, that is why I found Christine Hoffman's presentation fascinating. Who knew metamorphism could be so difficult? You're a vegetarian, then you're a carnivore. You stop eating in order to completely switch digestive systems, and in the meantime, you internally devour the nutrients in your own tail. All this makes amphibians pretty vulnerable to bad stuff. One of the first clues we ever had about acid rain killing the planet because of too much sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere was when amphibians started getting sick, malformed, and dying. Face it, you're in the water, you breathe through your skin, whatever is in that water gets into you, all while you're turning into something else.
This is when disease plays a big role in frog populations. So chytrid fungus and ranavirus are two diseases that right now globally are wiping out a lot of amphibians, and we're having a lot of problems, especially down in South America with chytrid fungus killing off a lot of populations. Most of our Maine amphibians are pretty resistant to chytrid, so they don't seem to have a problem, but there haven't been too many studies done on that yet. Coronavirus is another story. I've had times where I've walked into a pond and there's just been thousands of little belly-up tadpoles and salamander larvae because this virus has come in, and while they don't have an immune system, it's just wiped them out. Much better to be a turtle. Your immune system works, you can eat all the time. It doesn't matter what you eat because you're an omnivore. Most turtles can eat both plants and animals, and they'll just eat whatever happens to be around. They'll prefer animals. Like if you've got a nice juicy worm, that's kind of like the juicy hamburger at the bar where the broccoli is there, but are you really going to be interested? Skeletons tell us a lot about the animals too. So this frog skeleton is completely meant for locomotion and not so much for defense. Though defense is locomotion. If a fox comes up behind you, you're going to hop and you're going to try to get away. And if you can't get away, well, you have thousands of siblings. Maybe one of them will survive long enough to reproduce.
Once again, frogs and humans aren't that different. We have basically all the same organs, and they work mostly the same way. Instead of an ear with an eardrum inside, frogs have a tympanic membrane on the outside of the head where the ears ought to be, and they do about the same thing. Of course, the big difference is that frogs can jump 30 to 50 times their own body length. And that's because frog legs are built to leap. The thigh and shin bones are fused together so that they're lighter. That makes it a little harder to walk around, but much easier to jump a distance. And they've got these really long fingers, which also push when they jump. Basically, they're a jumping machine.
The legs that are nicely folded, it's like a folded compact string, so that when they jump, they can get a nice distance there. And then here's one of the weirder things about amphibians. They tend not to have ribs. These aren't ribs sticking out here. Those are just little protrusions sticking off of the vertebrae. They're for muscle attachment. They're not protecting anything. They're not going to bother protecting their organs because they're just going to try to get away instead. Here's the inside of a turtle shell. So the big skeletal adaptation for turtles, the thing that allows them to live so long, is their shell. I'm going to live to be 100 because I'm a turtle and nothing can eat me, and I'm just going to go with this. This is the shell in piece. This is a shell broken out. So it's the same animal. This is a box turtle. And if we look right down the middle, where my shadow is pointing, we've got a line.
Okay, so that answers a question that everyone who's ever watched a cartoon wonders. Can a turtle step out of a shell? No. The shell is just some lizard scales that get individually very big and fused together, and they're attached to the rib cage. So a turtle can never leave his shell without leaving his ribs behind. And here's another weird thing. Just about every critter with a skeleton has shoulder blades that are outside of the rib cage. Not the turtle. Obviously, a turtle doesn't move on land very well, and partly that's because the shoulders are out of the way. In fact, when the embryonic turtle is developing, the shoulders actually move from the area they inherited from ancient ancestors to where they are today. And here's another weird one. When a turtle pulls his head inside the shell, he's not pulling it straight in. He's actually coiling his neck like a snake. But a snake can coil up and down and side to side. A turtle can only coil up and down. So when he pulls the head in, the shoulders are out of the way and his neck is actually folded into an S shape. Turtles and frogs. This is a lecture at Fields Pond Audubon Center that took place over the winter. The speaker is Christine Hoffman, a University of Maine grad student. The show is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. And the radio station, even though it doesn't sound like it, is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8. We're in Holden, home of Fields Pond Audubon Center. We're catching a program put on by University of Maine grad student and soon-to-be doctor Christine Hoffman. We're talking turtles and frogs, two critters in Maine that we're all very familiar with, and yet there's so much we often don't know about them. For instance,
turtles and frogs both never stop growing. They're going to continue growing for the rest of their life, though each year it might get slower and slower. So this turtle, I know, is 1 year old because we've got a square here. This is the old scale. This is the new scale growing in underneath it. This is a yearling painted turtle. This box turtle is ancient. We've got a ring, and another ring, and another ring. Each of those rings, if we had a magnifying glass, we could count those and get an estimate of how old the turtle is. It gets really hard to count once they get past 25, but they still continue to produce rings. So that turtle is probably older than I am. Here's the bottom of the turtles. This one you can see those rings. This is a box turtle. You can see the rings along the scutes on the plastron. But on this other turtle on the left here, number 1, it's been worn smooth. This turtle is probably 50 years old or older because it has worn off the rings on its scales.
What I can see in the slide, and you can't, is exactly how these scales in a turtle line up. Yeah, a turtle never stops growing, and it's always adding more scales to its shell. So you can age a turtle by counting the scales. But the older it gets, and they can get to be 100 years old, the smaller the scales, until you have to use a magnifying glass. And then there's the problem that these shells are never replaced. So as they age, they can wear down a little bit, especially in the belly, which is often being dragged along the sand. There are 7 turtles in Maine. Let's meet them.
Painted turtles. This is the eastern painted turtle, Chrysemys picta. This is probably the most common turtle that we have in Maine. They like to live in permanent water. We can see this one's on top of a log here. He's basking in the sun. She's basking in the sun. The way that you can tell a painted turtle from others is by the relatively smooth shell. There's no bumps or ridges on that. They've got a relatively uniform color, except along the edge of each of those scales on its back, it's got a little bit of a outline. And then we've got some stripes on the head. And when we flip it over, they have this beautiful red color on it that's striped. And it looks like somebody has taken paint in a Sharpie and made a pattern out of it. So that's why they're called painted turtles. The reason I knew that the painted turtle on that slide 2 slides ago was a female was because of the length of her fingernails. This turtle here on the left, her fingernails are about the length of her female, so she's good, she's fashionable, she's got nice nails. This is the male. His fingers are about half the length of his fingernails. He's got Edward Scissorhands. When these turtles go to court, the male will slide over in front of the female underwater. He'll swim right up in her face. He'll take his palm, the back of his wrist, put them together, and start pulling his nails apart. And he waves his fingernails. Look how long my nails are. My nails are so perfect. And that's flirting in turtle language. If you take one of these guys and you put him in a fish tank and throw him up with other turtles, he might not know the difference, and he'll start doing that to them, and they'll just not be impressed because they don't care about his nails. So they need permanent water. But besides that, they're pretty generalist. They don't care if it's moving water. They don't care if it's deep water. They don't care if it's shallow water. They don't need cold water. They'll take warm water. They'll take muddy water. They'll take clear water. But they're also very skittish. So if you get close to this line of turtles, if you're in your kayak and you get too close to them, one of them will jump off. It'll be like, oh man, there's a predator. The predator's right there, and it's still coming, and it'll jump off. And then the other ones will be like, that one jumped off. Should I jump off? It is getting close. And then eventually you'll hit a point where 2 turtles have gone off on their own, and then everyone else just bails ship.
So you know these turtles, right? These are the ones you see most often, the colorful ones. They all line up on a log, sunning themselves, and if you get too close, they all start plunking in. So I don't know how you get close enough to see their fingernails to know if it's a female or male. Of course, long nails make sense in a female because she's the one that has to go dig that nest hole every year. So turtles don't have gills. They don't breathe through their skin. They have noses and lungs. So what do they do in winter?
So if they're living in permanent water, and permanent water freezes, they have to go somewhere in the winter. They go underneath the ice to the bottom of the lake, or the river, or the stream, or the pond. And they will go on top of the mud. They don't bury themselves. They'll just be on top of the surface of the bottom. And they're going to slow down their heartbeat to about maybe once a minute. And they're going to slow down. They're not coming up for breath anymore. Instead, they're going to start breathing out of their shell. They have this nice, big, smooth surface that's right up against the water. The water's going to be cold, so it'll have enough oxygen in it. They're going to slow down their oxygen consumption. And instead of using their lungs, they're just going to use their shell. So the shell actually is alive, and it's got blood passing through it for this purpose. Snapping turtles. Snapping turtles are great, especially if you have a group of kids, because every one of them wants to tell you about how its uncle killed one with a shovel once. People love to hate snapping turtles, but snapping turtles, they really are gentle when they don't have turtle PMS, which is when we usually see them. Okay. The way that we know this is a snapping turtle is generally by its size. These guys will get to be about the size of a hubcap. If you talk to that 4-year-old whose uncle killed one, it was the size of 2 hubcaps. They have this spiky dinosaur tail, so they kind of look like a stegosaurus from the back. The back edge of the shell also has some ridges on them. The legs here have a little bit of little scales sticking out there too, and they got these big claws. And if they're on land, they're probably snapping. And the reason that they do that is because this is what they're meant for. They're supposed to be underwater on the bottom. They're not swimming up through the water column nearly as much as a Blanding's turtle or as a painted turtle. So they're adapted to living on the bottom. They're a sit-and-wait predator. They also, they're scavengers as well. There's nothing that a snapping turtle likes better than a dead deer that's floating in the water. They'll get that. But they go down to the bottom, and they'll kind of bury themselves, and they'll just sit there, and they'll wait for something to come by, and then they'll eat it. They blend in, and they're slow, and they're patient. Because of that, only their top is exposed. So they've got this nice big shell on top that's smooth. Here we've got one that's up on a log. She's basking. So days when it's sunny out and it's cold are the best days to find turtles because they come up and they're trying to warm their body up. So here we've got one that's basking. And she's way out on this river. So if she gets spooked, she's just going to jump in the water. She's not going to sit there and defend herself. Like if you go up to that turtle, it's going to try to get away. It's not going to hold its ground and be aggressive and snap at you. It's when they're on land that they don't feel secure. So this is the way that we usually see snapping turtles because we happen to be land animals ourselves. We'll see them crossing the road, we'll see them trying to migrate. Generally when they're on land, it's because it's a female who wants to lay her eggs. She's a very pregnant lady and you are in her way. So she thinks you're going to eat her. She's going to be just as aggressive as a chipmunk if you were holding it, or as a bat as if you were holding it, or if you hold a pigeon, it's going to try to peck at you.
Yeah, but a pigeon or chipmunk doesn't have a shell. Why don't snapping turtles just go into their shells instead of trying to snap at you? Good question. And the good answer is that snapping turtles are predators that sit on the bottom of the pond and wait. Their bellies are seldom exposed. And they need a certain amount of mobility in order to grab food. So the snapping turtle shell covers much less than most turtle shells. Their legs and tail can't be drawn into the shell all the way. Without the snapping, a snapper couldn't defend itself quite as well as many of its cousins.
It's because they can't pull all the way in their shell and protect them that they have to find a different way to protect themselves, and that's why they'll snap. It is true that they can break fingers. I don't necessarily know it's true that they can take fingers off, but I will tell you that once they do bite your finger, they're not going to let go until they have to. If you poke this thing with a stick and it bites the stick, you can lift the stick up and carry the turtle that way. They're dead set to hold on until the threat is over. But they're nice turtles. They really are nice turtles. They tend to smell a little when they're young, so they don't make good pets because they're stinky. And you really wouldn't want to cuddle because then it's on land and it's not protected again. But I've had internships where I've been in charge of training students to work with traps and try to get these animals out of traps and move around them. And one of the things I love to do is sit down on top of the turtle while it's in the water and poke it in the nose. It doesn't care. It's protected. It knows I can't get at its belly, so I can honk its nose all day long and it's not going to snap. Take it out of the water and then I'll need stitches.
Okay, that's 2 turtles so far, painted and snappers. There are 5 more. Let's see, Blanding's turtle, musk turtle. I'm bad at this game. Well, today's show comes from a presentation at Fields Pond Audubon Center, where Christine Hoffman started off by telling us we're more like turtles than we are like frogs. She's a grad student in Orono, and we'll get back to Maine turtles in a moment. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Today's show is coming to you from Holden, home of Fields Pond Audubon Center. This winter, a University of Maine grad student and future doctor, Christine Hoffman, did a presentation on Maine turtles and frogs. There was a lot to learn, but I saved the show until the frogs and turtles were actually coming out in the spring. There are 7 turtles in Maine. So far, we've covered painted and snapper. Next.
Okay, spotted turtles. Spotted turtles are tiny. They get to be about 5 inches long. They're completely adorable. And they're a specialist. A lot of times when wildlife becomes a specialist, it depends on one tiny niche. It has trouble with development, changes in its environment. So because of that, they're threatened in Maine. The special concern are threatened throughout a lot of their range. And what I pretty much mean here is that this animal, unlike the snapping turtle and unlike the painted turtle, can't go into any pond and live there. It can't go into a river and live there. It can't go into a stream and live there. It has to go into one specific wetland, the vernal pool. And if you don't have vernal pools, if you wipe them all out, you wipe out the spotted turtles. Vernal pools are easy to bulldoze because they're not there half of the year, so it's easy to not know that there's a wetland that needs to be avoided.
Okay, let's stop it right there. Vernal pools. At the top of the show, I posed a question. If you went into the forest and took every bear, moose, deer, raccoon, fisher, bobcat, squirrel, or mammal of any kind, and all the birds in the forest and put them into one big pile, and if you took every spotted salamander, blue spotted salamander, wood frog, and maybe all the turtles and other critters that breed in or use all those puddles in that same forest, and you put those in a pile, which pile would be bigger? Well, according to the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and I'll quote this, it says, the collective weight, or biomass, of these unseen spring amphibian sentinels has been estimated to exceed that of all birds and mammals combined in some forests with productive pools. Indeed, their sheer abundance and palatability has many biologists and sportsmen convinced that the terrestrial wanderings of pool-breeding frogs and salamanders play a powerful role in the local ecology of Maine's forests. And that's just it. There's a lot of big critters we care about, especially the game animals, but also the birds. But that's only half the critters out there. The little ones are often food for the big ones, or they just wander off, live out their lives in the leaf litter, and when they die, they return nutrients to the soil. They are walking fertilizer. Vernal pools turn out to be vital in Maine because glaciers left us a lot of them, and our whole ecosystem evolved around them. And if you're a spotted turtle, you couldn't do without them.
Vernal pools are ephemeral wetlands. They're there in the spring. They have lots of amphibians laying their eggs in them in the spring, lots of tadpoles, and then they dry up during the warmest months of the summer when the groundwater goes down. And they'll fill again generally in the fall and freeze over in the winter. To be a vernal pool specialist and a turtle means you have to adapt your life cycle to the seasonality of your habitat. So this animal hibernates during the winter, generally underneath like a bush or something in the vernal pool, underwater, where it's down far enough that it won't freeze solid. The hatchlings can freeze solid, and sometimes you'll be walking across the vernal pool and you look at the ice and there's this little hatchling turtle mid-stroke, just frozen in the water. And then when it thaws, it'll go back to swimming. Great, so they wake up from hibernation, and the first thing on their mind is that they have to mate. So the males will start chasing down the females, and they'll start courting them. They'll mate, and then the males go off, and the females go their way. Females will lay their eggs, sometimes on tussocks within the vernal pool, sometimes in agricultural fields nearby, sometimes in just sunny spots in the woods. Then when they're done with that, they're done with reproduction, that's when they'll start to eat. So they've woken up, they're starving, they're not going to eat right away. They're going to go get down to business, and then they'll consider breakfast. By the time they're done laying their eggs, by the time they're just done with the mating itself, there's plenty of egg masses in that pool from the amphibians. The spotted salamanders have come, and the Jefferson salamanders and the blue spotted salamanders have come, and the wood frogs have come. They laid their eggs, and they are these nice snacks for the spotted turtles. So the spotted turtles will binge eat on these eggs. Then as the season develops, you start having less food available, the pond dries up, you get to July, and you just have this bowl in the ground with no water in it. And if you have a spotted turtle, that's a good time to go take a nap. They estivate. Estivate is the opposite of hibernation. It's sleeping during the summer. So they'll find a nice bushy area or someplace where there's lots of leaf litter. They'll go underneath the leaves and they'll just sleep for the next 2 months. Then in the fall, they wake up, they go back to the swamp. Swamp's got water in it. Doesn't have too much food. They might eat a little. And then they go find a place to hibernate. So that's the year. They spend most of it asleep.
Spotted turtles. Don't look for them up here. They get up to southern Maine, but not as far north as Bangor. We're just a little too cold. Actually, this area of Maine is a transition zone for a lot of critters. At a spot just above Old Town, you are exactly halfway between the equator and the North Pole. The 45th parallel runs across the state right here. We're too far north for some southern critters, too far south for northern critters, but for a bunch of critters, we're right at the line. Okay, let's do another turtle.
Wood turtles. This is another specialist animal, and because of that, they are declining in their populations. This is a special concern animal. I don't know of any along the Penobscot, but some of the tributaries have wood turtle populations on them. They're called wood turtles because their shell looks like a piece of wood. They blend in real well to the forest around them. They're a sizable turtle, 8 inches to a foot in length across the top of the shell carapace. And when we flip them over, we've got the same things as with the spotted turtles, where each turtle has a different fingerprint pattern along its plastron and on its belly. Here we've got a male and a female. I know because this one's concave. If you are a male and you're going to try to crawl on top of this bowl-shaped female and do your business, it makes sense for you to do a little tummy tuck so that you fit like spoons. The females will have a flat belly, so you can tell the sexes apart by looking at the shape of their plastron.
Wait a minute. A female wood turtle's belly is flat, but a male's belly is concave so that when he climbs up on top of her, he doesn't slide off. Any more of this stuff, and Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is going to get an R rating. These guys are kind of weird. Wood turtles are river specialists. They like their water moving more than most turtles do. They like it cleaner. And they spend more time up on land than other turtles. They'll spend weeks under a bush or out in fields or sandlots.
And this can become a problem because if you're a farmer and you're out haying your field, you're not going to notice this chunk of wood that's actually a turtle sticking out there. So they get into trouble with haying machines. They also get into trouble because they look like snapping turtles. And there will be people who will deliberately kill a wood turtle because they think it's one of those bad, nasty, horribly aggressive, will hunt you down while you sleep, snapping turtles.
Turtles on Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. We've got abundant wildlife in the state, but how much do we really know about all of them? Christine Hoffman is a doctoral candidate at the University of Maine, and this presentation happened over the winter at Fields Pond Audubon Center in Holden. I was there, and I saved it until all the frogs and turtles started coming out. And that's happening right now. We'll wrap up the turtles in a moment. I know it doesn't sound like it, but this is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Today's show is mostly about turtles. Many of us get excited by seeing deer, moose, and bear, but we often walk right by other critters that we take for granted. We see a turtle, we say, hey, it's a turtle. But there are 7 different species in Maine. They look different, act different, and live in different places. Christine Hoffman is a graduate student at the University of Maine. She'll get her doctorate soon enough, and she did a presentation at Fields Pond Audubon Center over the winter. With turtles now popping out and sunning on logs, it seemed like a good time to get to know what we've been missing. So what's next?
Box turtles. Box turtles are endangered in Maine. We're at the northern edge of the range, so this is really a range issue. Box turtles have a high dome. They live on land, so they don't have to be aerodynamic to swim underneath the water. This is the edge of a hiking path. So it's this nice sunny area with a little bit of cover. It's got this nice thick brush next to it, so if it wanted to, it could scurry into the brush. But it's just hanging out on the path, getting a little bit of sun, warming up its body to help with the metabolism. They're called box turtles because they fold up like a box. So there's no tail sticking out there. This is the wood turtle, again, on the right here for comparison. Wood turtle, his head is sticking out a little, his legs are sticking out a little. Wood turtles have problems with otters, where an otter will just gnaw on them for a while and eat one leg at a time. Box turtles don't have that problem. They just pull all of their appendices, their tail, and their head into their shell, close up their shell nicely, and call it a day. There's a lot of variation in the coloration of box turtles. So some of them tend to be really bright yellow, some of them have a lot more black and a drab. If you go down to Florida, the box turtles have lines instead of spots along their back. This is a male, and I know it's a male because of his eyes. Male box turtles have these beautiful blood red eyes. The female eyes tend to be yellow, or they'll be a brown color. And this is one of the things that makes box turtles really weird for a turtle. This turtle is looking at fruit. This turtle is on land. Box turtles love berries. They'll hang out underneath raspberry and blackberry bushes, and they'll just eat all the berries that fall. And then if there are slugs that come out to eat the berries, that makes it even better. They love slugs. But this turtle's eating on land. Most turtles don't have saliva. It's really hard to swallow things if you don't have saliva. Box turtles do. It's one of those special adaptations that makes them a little different. They're really smart. When it rains, the raindrops kind of pound the ground. These turtles will walk up to a muddy area and they'll just stomp back and forth and rock their bodies, and that causes the earthworms to surface, and then they eat them.
Wait a minute. It's a turtle that lives on land. It likes berries. It has saliva. Who knew that mattered? And it stomps its feet to draw out earthworms. This is why we sometimes tackle offbeat subjects in the show. So much of nature is right under our noses. Another thing about box turtles, even if you live to be 100 years old, they will outlive you.
We know that box turtles can live to be at least 100 in the wild. A lot of times when we have age estimates for reptiles and amphibians, it's based off of zoo animals or an animal in someone's private collection and not a wild animal, because it's generally hard to know this is the same snapping turtle that was there 50 years ago. There was a fellow in Long Island, New York, who carved his initials and the date into the back of a turtle. And that same turtle was found alive and kicking and eating bugs and doing all kinds of turtles things 100 years later. So they're long-lived. They're very long-lived. If you have a pet box turtle and you take really good care of it, it's going to outlive you. It's like parrots. You have to put them in your will. Musk turtles. These guys are tiny. They're even smaller than the spotted turtles. I'm going to go ahead and call them Maine's smallest turtles because we don't have bogs. Bog turtles are tiny. The musk turtles have another name, and based off of the species Odoratus, you could probably guess it. It's the stink pot. These are stink pot turtles. They have a very high dome along their back. They've got really big heads, stripes down their heads. And when you're out paddling, if you look along the tops of floating masses of algae or on logs that are very close to the surface, you'll see these guys. They don't like to come out above the water quite as readily as the snapping turtles and the painted turtles, so you won't see them as much. You have to kind of look for them. And the search image that you want to find one of these is to look for a softball. If you see something that's almost floating that looks like a softball, it's probably a stink pot. When you pick it up, you want to be careful of two things. One is that they don't bite you, because that is a very big head with a lot of muscles. And the other is that you don't get musked on.
It's the skunk defense. You pick one up, it'll stink you, or bite you, or both. Musk turtles have heavy shells. They hate being out of the water, and even their nest holes are going to be just a few feet from the water. And that leaves us just one Maine turtle left.
Blanding's turtle. It's called Blanding's turtle because it's named after the person that first found them. This is a very skittish, secretive, cryptic turtle, even though they're a relatively large turtle. The shell is shaped kind of like an army helmet, and that's about the size that they are. They're a relatively large, heavy turtle. But when you get close to one, before you even see it, it's going to dive. And because of that, these turtles were not described until about 50, 60 years after most of the other turtles, because no one could find one. It took a long time to discover the turtles. So when this fellow, William Blanding, finally got his hands on one, they named the turtle after him. They've got a yellow chin, bright yellowish, and that's also diagnostic for the species. They have little spots on those shells, kind of an off-white yellowish spot, and it looks like somebody dripped paint on them. They're not perfect circles like they are on the spotted turtle. They're very aquatic. So here we've got two turtles on a log, and they're surrounded by lily pads. Lily pads only grow in permanent water and relatively deep water, but still shallow enough that light hits the bottom and you can reach down to get your stems there. So that's a good depth for these turtles. Okay. So that's the turtles.
So that's it, all 7 Maine turtles. You're probably never going to see a Blandings turtle, even though they do breed in southern Maine. They're endangered everywhere they exist because we pretty much drain their wetlands. Well, if you're still listening, then I'm guessing you're curious about all of Maine's critters, not just the ones you can eat. Well, good, because it's more of the same next week, more about frogs and toads. We started today's show with the discovery that people aren't that different from lizards, but we're really different from frogs. University of Maine's Christine Hoffman returns so we can meet more of those critters right under our very noses. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine returns next Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 8, and all shows are archived at 929theticket.com. It's brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket.